Hello everybody! I'm here to talk to you about 11 books I've read recently. 5 of these were books I read at the end of October or in November, but don't count for my A to Z challenge. And then the other 6 are books from my A to Z TBR that I have now read. So let's get into it. This is going to be a long video, I can tell already. Get some tea, buckle up. Here we go. Let's start with those 5 books that don't count for the A to Z reading challenge. The first 2 are ones that I forgot to mention in my last wrap-up because I just blanked on that. So, Ooku, The Inner Chambers, Volume 3 by Fumi Yoshinaga. I haven't talked about Volume 2 yet. That will be in my Otherwise Award Winners wrap-up coming very soon. It's filmed, it's coming. Volume 3 is a direct continuation on from the story started in Volume 2 about the first female shogun in Japan. This is speculative historical fiction. It's alternate history where a plague has killed most of the men and women assume a lot of formerly male-dominated roles in Japanese society. And it's historical because it takes place like from the 1680s onwards, so a lot of it is, you know, hundreds of years ago. I continue to find the series very interesting. And now that I've adjusted to the very strange, like Elizabethan English, the archaic English used in the translation, it's a lot easier reading, but it took a while to adjust to the language style in it. The other one I forgot to talk about before is Well Met by Jen DeLuca. This is a contemporary romance novel mostly set in a Renaissance fair in a small town. I wanted to read this because of the Ren Fair aspect, and I ended up really loving it. Just like pretty much every aspect of this I really enjoyed, especially the kind of emotional and character development of the main characters and how that worked with their love story essentially. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. The basic premise here is like enemies to lovers, a man and a woman, Emily and Simon. Trying to remember their names. They don't really like each other when they first meet each other, but in their Ren Fair personas, a serving wench and a pirate, they have great chemistry and they get to know each other better. This is an unusual romance novel where I think the character development is done really well, and there's that point where the love interests kind of break up because they have a disagreement. And it's the first time where I've been reading a romance novel and I got to that point and I went, this was very believable, and if they never got back together again, they have perfectly good reasons for that. I mean, like, I want them to get back together again, but wow, that was realistic. I don't know if anybody else has had that reaction to it before, but yeah. So I enjoyed this a lot. I'll probably read the second in the series. I think it's called Well Played, though I've seen some people say that they did not like how certain aspects of that one was done, so we'll see what I think of that one. Anyway, moving on. Next, Datura, or A Delusion We All See by Leena Krohn. This is translated. Krohn is a Finnish SFF author, and I cannot remember the translator's name at the moment. I will leave all that information down in the description like I usually do. This is probably my favorite novel I've read by Leena Krohn. And it's very similar to some of her other ones I've read in that every chapter is kind of a vignette, a little story unto itself, and it all kind of weaves together into a broader story. This is one where I didn't feel like it was disjointed because of that structure. It actually really worked. It really flowed for me, and I really liked the topic. It's basically the memories of a woman who's been intentionally poisoning herself with Datura to help her asthma, but it of course is highly poisonous, and it's causing irreversible damage to her mind, her brain basically, and it's causing her to hallucinate and kind of break from reality. So I think the theme, the topic of this is pretty much what the title says, that reality is kind of a shared delusion, and when you break from that, you see it in a very different way. Like, what are you really perceiving? Can we be sure that we're all perceiving the same thing? And you know, what happens when you're hallucinating and you can't tell the difference between reality or not, and what happens when your hallucinations seem exactly like the real things. This woman also works for like a paranormal magazine, like some weird stuff, and she meets a lot of the regular contributors and readers of the magazine, and of course they share things with her like, is that real or not? Very, very interesting. I enjoyed the feel of this, kind of the flavor of it, and the topic in general. So yeah, definitely my favorite thing I've read by Leena Krohn so far. Speaking of things that I really enjoyed, Pet by Akwaeke Emezi. I loved this book. I thought everything about it was pretty much perfect, and I was not expecting to enjoy it so much or to really feel it so much, but I did. This is a young adult kind of fantasy novel. It's set in the near future after a revolution has changed everything. It's set in Lucille, a kind of small town in what I think was once the United States, and it's kind of described as a utopia, a world where monsters no longer exist, except that apparently one does. The main character is Jam, a teenage girl who accidentally brings forth this kind of monstrous looking creature from her mother's painting. It's called Pet, and it tells her it's there to hunt a monster and it needs her help, and they go looking for the monster. I was a bit worried that it was going to be a very upsetting read, kind of in the way that Freshwater by Akwaeke Emezi was for me. That book has so many trigger warnings, it has a lot of sexual and emotional abuse in it, and I was a bit worried that Pet was going to be that difficult for me to read, especially because I went into it knowing there was a content warning for the sexual and physical abuse of a child, which is there, but it's not shown on the page, but it is referred to. So this turned out to be such a good read. Like, I keep saying this, but it hit me at just, I think, the right moment. You know, Jam lives in a world where a lot of the issues that we're dealing with now in the real world have been solved. There's been like this political revolution against racism, sexism, violence towards, you know, people of color and women, and it's a completely different world. It's a much safer, nicer, more loving world. But I think the point of this story, like what I took away from it, is that you have to know your history. It's not enough to just defeat the monsters and say that they are gone forever and then never talk about them again. Monsters will always be there, and if you don't talk about them, then you end up with a generation that can't recognize them when they appear. And Jam and her best friend Redemption, they kind of have to circumvent the adults in their lives to find a monster. And they should have been taught some of this stuff before. And you know, there's a lesson to be learned from that. Something about that really spoke to me in the moment that I was reading it, probably because I finished this book a couple of days before the US presidential election, and a lot of this stuff was really on my mind. But there are a number of things I really appreciated about this book. I think what it comes down to is this is a young adult novel that uses some kind of aspects that are really common in current and past YA trends, but uses them in a very different way. You have that revolution aspect, the rebellion, but in this case, it's in the past. This is a generation of kids and teenagers who've grown up after the revolution, not something that's, you know, covered in a lot of the big blockbuster YA dystopia revolution stories. It's also kind of like that quest. It's, you know, teenagers trying to do something without their parents knowing, like all these sorts of things. It just came across so differently. There was this big twist on everything. I also really appreciated that the families in the story were so strong and loving. Jam is a transgender teenage girl. She's got a good relationship with her parents, who are very loving and wonderful people. Her best friend Redemption comes from this kind of sprawling, loving, close, warm family. And there was just this sense of family in the novel that I was not expecting and that I really, really appreciated. I love reading about that in fiction, especially when like teenagers and children are concerned, because I think it's too easy to write middle grade and YA stories where teenagers don't get along with their families, don't get along with their parents, don't talk to them or whatever. And you get a little bit of the reverse in the story. So I super loved this. I'm not talking about it coherently, but I would highly recommend it. It was one of my favorite reads of October. Then something completely different. I read An Almost Zero Waste Life by Megean Weldon. This is obviously about zero waste living. It's another one of those beginner level books. How do you get into zero waste? How do you start doing this? I picked this up because it's written by somebody who lives in the Midwest and has been doing zero waste living for a number of years in the Midwest, and not one of like the sexy cool parts of the Midwest like Minneapolis. I mean, like, she's from Kansas City. And this is something that I've wanted more. I don't live on the coast. I don't live in a big city, and that's where a lot of zero waste and low impact living people are from, and so they have access to a lot of resources and services and stuff that you just don't find in rural Midwest America. Unfortunately, this book doesn't address really any of that. It did not have a new angle on the subject matter, I guess is what I want to say. It's pretty much the same tips and tricks and advice and how to get started stuff that you'll find in any other zero waste blog or article or book. It was done well, it was pretty, it was inspirational. There were a couple of things in it that were new to me, but not that much. And I probably am a little bit harsher towards it because I was disappointed that it didn't address like the Midwest situation. Oh well. My overall impression from this book is that it was perfectly fine for what it is. It's for beginners and it's way more vague than I thought it should actually be. If you're gonna like buy this book, I think you should get more concrete advice and help from it. And it's relatively vague and tells you to go do a lot of homework on your own to find things. And I think it should do more than that. But anyway, it was fine. It inspired me to do a couple of things, and that's why I read it, for basically the motivation. All right, onwards to the A to Z books, which I imagine is what a lot of you guys wanted to hear about. I have read 6 of the books from my TBR for this month for the letters A, B, F, G, Q, and V. So I'm going to talk about these in alphabetical order because why not? It is the A to Z challenge this month. So first up is Adulthood Rites by Octavia Butler. This is the second book in the Xenogenesis series, which is also sometimes called Lilith's Brood. I read the first book, Dawn, years ago, and I don't have a super clear memory of everything in it. So I went into Adulthood Rites kind of cold and just kind of remembered things as it came up in the text. And I thought this was a really interesting read, but it immediately started reminding me of a couple of the things I didn't really like about Dawn and that I have struggled with in some of Butler's other books that I've read. Mainly, this is a story about the human race being remade, you know, like genetically remade, being kind of subsumed into another alien race. And it is a story about reproduction, about humans being denied the ability to reproduce as they have before and being forced into reproducing in an alien way with alien partners. And not all of it is consensual. So I think what's important to know, you know, for me, I remind myself of this a lot when I'm reading Butler's books, is that these books are old. Adulthood Rites was written in 1988. This book is over 30 years old, and it's very difficult for me to know exactly what was the conversation, what was the discourse around the subjects of sexuality and feminism and women's bodies and reproductive rights and everything more than 30 years ago, before I was even conceived myself. You know, I just don't know that context. I don't know what necessarily Butler may have been kind of in conversation with, you know, in her own head, but also within her stories. And I really struggle with some of the things in this book, and also what I remembered of Dawn, with basically, you know, Lilith being forcibly impregnated against her will. And then she's like, yeah, after the fact, I'm fine with this. And just this whole thing about, you know, denying humans the ability to reproduce and to have the kinds of families that we've always had in the past and everything, to have, you know, the future of your race and something very personal happening with your own body being dictated by aliens. Whoo boy. And interestingly, I didn't know it was going to be this way, but, you know, the main character of this book, Akin, He is a human Oankali or alien construct. He's a child of both races basically, and his journey in this book is basically coming in contact with resistor human villages that refuse to join with the Oankali, and they want their reproductive rights back basically. And he kind of takes up their call. Like, he wants to help them, he wants to kind of give them something back. And I wasn't expecting that from the story. And I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed Akemi as a character and seeing things through his eyes. For most of the book, he is basically in an infant's body, but with the intelligence and the cognition and the speaking abilities of an adult, which is very kind of weird, but it works. It really does. So I was reading this and thinking, man, I think I really do not enjoy some of the subject matter of this. Like, on a gut level, I think it's super hetero when it doesn't need to be. I think it really forces men and women into gender roles, and especially like sexual gender roles that don't really exist. But at the same time, it's done so well, it's written well, it has so many interesting ideas. This is some darn good science fiction with a very interesting, well thought out alien race, and the culture, the reproduction, the biology, it's just so interesting. So, I don't know, maybe that's just my experience with reading Butler these days, is that I enjoy it, but it's always challenging me so much. Next up, The Bedlam Stacks by Natasha Pulley. This one took me multiple tries to actually read it. I tried to read this book when it came out back in 2017, I think, and I DNF'd it because it was really slow and I thought it was historical fiction and I didn't really care. And then fast forward a couple of years and I picked it up again for a group read, and I finished it and it was really good. But this book is like the definition of a slow burn. It is a very, very slow reveal of what is actually happening and who people actually are, and it was so good. So this is mostly historical fiction involving a journey to Peru for quinine, to get trees that produce quinine. The story takes place in 1860, and quinine is very important because at the time it was the only way of treating malaria, and they really needed quinine in India at the time because of malaria, you know, devastating the population. So it concerns a man named Merrick who has worked kind of as a smuggler for the East India Company, being sent to Peru along with one of his friends who also worked for the company, and they have this quest basically in Peru where they're trying to not be shot by every single person they meet, because everybody knows that they're there to steal quinine, and they very, very likely to die. But it also concerns Merrick's family history with a town called New Bethlehem in Peru, where his grandfather had lived, where his father had been born. And when Merrick goes there, he discovers some things that are very interesting. I don't want to give anything away, but I do want to say that if you're reading this as fantasy, you have to get pretty far into the book for the fantasy elements to become clearer. And I think it's worth getting to that point. The slow reveal, putting together those pieces. One of the things I really enjoyed about the way this book was written is that there are clues. There are things, like Merrick will just offhandedly mention what seems to be this little tiny thing, and then 200 pages later he mentions it again and you're like, oh my god, that was huge. But there are these implications and connections between things, and I really enjoyed it. So yeah, I would recommend, I guess. I'm not really interested in the other two books in this world, The Watchmaker of Filigree Street and then its sequel, which just came out. They concern different characters. The Bedlam Stacks is more like a prequel, and I kind of liked it just on its own. I'm not really sure if I'll read the other books by Natasha Pulley right now, but I sure did enjoy this book. From a Shadow Grave by Andi C. Buchanan. This is kind of a ghost story supernatural novella about a young woman who is killed in the 1930s, and the story is in 4 parts with 4 different versions of what could have happened to her. She becomes a ghost. There's one where time travel is involved, one where she's rescued, one where she rescues herself, and all like how did her story end up after that point and with this thing that happened to her. and I enjoyed it. It took me a little bit to get into it. The first 2 parts were okay, and then the 3rd and 4th parts I enjoyed quite a bit. I think I would have liked this even more if it hadn't been written in 2nd person. It's addressed to you, and I don't really know why. It just bothered me a little bit. I just kept thinking, like, why is this being addressed to me? I am not this character. It's kind of odd. But if that had been changed, the story would have had a very different feel as well. So I liked it. Not my favorite thing. I would definitely read more by Buchanan in the future, though. Genderqueer by Maia Kobabe. This is a graphic memoir about the author's experience growing up, struggling with your gender identity, not feeling like he is a woman, but not feeling like he is a man either. Also dealing with, recognizing their asexuality. I thought this was a super interesting memoir. I kind of read it on a whim because it was recommended on the Green Bean podcast by Katie Green, which I watch her channel because, she's an artist and a knitter and everything, but she reviews books occasionally, and she mentioned this one. I think she's friends with Kobabe, and I thought, well, I should maybe try reading that, and I'm so glad that I did. This was just a very helpful and interesting and well-told story of someone realizing what their identity is, recognizing it, figuring it out, and I really liked that. This is also the first memoir I've ever read by somebody who identifies as genderqueer. I'm more used to seeing people who identify as non-binary, and genderqueer is actually a different thing. The author uses Spivak pronouns, which is also pretty new to me, and working on being better at that, using the right pronouns. So this one, I was very into it. I read almost the entire thing in a single sitting. The only thing that I thought was a little bit odd is that it ends a little bit abruptly. Maybe that's because I was reading the ebook version. I couldn't see how close I was to the end, but I got to the last page and I did not realize it was the last page, so it felt like it ended very abruptly for me. Perhaps not the experience people would have if they were reading it in the physical book, but other than that, I very much enjoyed this, and I would love to read other graphic novels by this author whenever he illustrates more of them. Another comic/graphic novel that really touched me actually was Quiet Girl in a Noisy World, an introvert story by Debbie Tung. I read, I think it was called Book Life by Tung in the past, which is a collection of comics about the love of books, which I thought was fine, but not super memorable. And I kind of expected that Quiet Girl would be very similar. I thought it was going to be a collection of relatively disconnected comics on the topic of introversion and shyness. It really is much more of a story, though. Tung's story of being an introvert and trying to force herself into an extrovert mold at work, like in the workplace, and how exhausting that is, and then learning more about introversion and trying to be a bit truer to herself and not force herself to be something that she doesn't really want to be. I related to a lot of this. So I really liked this, and as somebody who identifies as quite shy and introverted and also socially anxious like the author, it touched a nerve for me. So yeah, I really like this. I would recommend it for fellow introverts. It's probably a very good description of our lives. And lastly, The Vanished Birds by Simon Jimenez. This is a science fiction novel that I listened to on audiobook, and it was quite good. I really enjoyed the first half of the book, but it started to lose me a little bit in the second half, possibly because I really liked the structure of the beginning, which began a bit like a mosaic novel with these very different individual stories. It almost felt like a short story collection where the stories were just related with some of the characters and events, and I really liked that. And then the book started to focus a bit more on the main character and kind of muddied that structure a little bit, and I lost a little bit of interest in it. So this is about a young boy who mysteriously appears on a planet. He does not speak, he only plays music on a flute, and someone thinks that he has this mysterious, amazing ability that might change the world. And they're just waiting for him to manifest that ability. So you get a lot of different viewpoints on the story, the backstories, a lot of the characters, and it all kind of converges, it all intersects, it's all important to understand because it all builds up to this kind of world-changing event. And like I said, I really enjoyed the first half. I liked the tone of it, I liked the structure of it and the way it was introducing the characters. And then by the time we got to the middle part where we had learned a lot more about Otto, the main character, I didn't find him to be super interesting, to be honest. And then when we learn a lot more about him, it gets really sad. Like, the final part of this book it depressed the hell out of me. I kind of liked the way that it ended, but it does not have a happy ending, unfortunately. So yeah, I enjoyed this. I will definitely read anything else that Simon Jimenez comes out with. But this one was a little bit of a mixed bag. That is it. I think I'm done talking now. I'm just completely talked out. Those are all the books I've read in the last 2 weeks or so, I think. Definitely let me know what you think of these if you have read them or if you want to read them. I'm really curious what people think about a bunch of these, especially the ones that I really loved. So yeah, let me know, leave me a comment down below. I'll be back to talk to you again soon, and until then, bye.